So like the landscape thing and the nature thing and the climate thing, it's been present in my work always. And it's not even something that I really consciously think a lot about. I spent the first 24, almost 25 years of my life in Montana. And that's like growing up, 18 years in the same house, going to college for 5 years, and then living in that town an additional year, so like Montana is very heavily like in my DNA. I meet other people from Montana who are like, oh, but then I went to like, Juilliard for my undergrad. And I'm like, oh, well, then when you were 18, you went to New York, and like, you probably don't ever want to go back to Montana because that's, but I am very nostalgic for it. But I've always made music about nature. And I mean, if you could see where I grew up, like if you could just stand there right now, if I could transport you there for 30 seconds, you'd be like, oh, okay, I get it. I get all of it. Like it's snow-capped mountains combined with like a massive glacial lake combined with like a prairie valley. I mean, it's like unbelievably beautiful.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. Hey there, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the show. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Tyler, and I'm a composer, broadcaster, and producer who loves talking with creative people about how they make their work and what drives them to create. There are over 40 episodes in the archive of this podcast for you to explore, so after this one, if you haven't listened to any others, I hope you'll dig into some of those other conversations. And if you've been listening for a while, welcome back. It's so great to have you. Since the last episode of Music Maker, I launched a new project called Living Classical. It's an independently produced radio show exploring adventurous music from across the classical spectrum. You can find it at livingclassicalradio.com. Put a lot of hard work into that since we last met, and I really hope that you'll check it out. Today, I'm joined by composer Christopher Stark, whose music is deeply rooted in the landscapes of the American West. Chris grew up in rural Montana, and that connection to space and environment has remained a quiet through line in his work ever since. His pieces have been performed by ensembles like the Los Angeles Philharmonic, Alarm Will Sound, and the American Composers Orchestra. And whether he's writing concert music or film scores, his sense of sonic atmosphere and details always come through. In our conversation, we talked about how geography and memory shape his creative language. We also dig into what residencies offer, the time, space, and perspective to reconnect with the why behind making art in the first place. The conversation begins in just a moment. Before we jump into things, a quick note. If you want to stay connected to what I'm building here, like new episodes, behind-the-scenes thoughts, and updates on projects like Living Classical, my new independently produced radio show, well, the best way to do that is through the newsletter. You can sign up on our website, that's looseleaftransmissions.com, or visit the link in the show notes. Now, on to my conversation with Christopher Stark. Well, Chris, it's so great to finally sit down with you, not just for the purposes of this podcast, but also because I've really admired your music for quite some time. And I'll just share very quickly that my introduction to your music was your piece Maple, which was recorded and released by the Unheard Of Ensemble. And that was, I think, maybe like a little over 6 years ago. And you've just released a new album with them called Fire Ecologies, which is, I have to say, is unlike any music I've ever heard before. My wife, Suzanne, and I were listening to it in the car when it first came out, and we were like, what is Chris doing? Like, we need to know more. So anyway, it feels like a full circle moment, and I knew it was time to have you on the show. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for your kind words. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll probably give more throughout the conversation, so fair warning. So where we like to start here on Music Maker is as far back as you're willing to share or as far back as you remember. And that is, what is your earliest artistic memory as a composer or even just as a creative?
Wow, that's such a good question. Earliest memories of this journey. I think of most people who I've met who are like creatives have kind of like always had the impulse to be making things, and it sort of is just kind of a part of your life, no matter kind of what you're doing. And I'm not sure I separate that from composing. Like, if I was never allowed to compose ever again, I would, like make coffee tables or bake cakes, or
Yeah,
I would
right.
be doing something, making something. And so I've always had the impulse to be wanting to make things. I suppose with music, the first time that I really wrote music was when I was probably like a freshman or sophomore in high school, and I got an electric guitar from a pawn shop down the road, and just started writing guitar riffs and layering them on a tape recorder and writing songs, but like heavy metal songs, which is kind of like not the same thing as a song, like, because my favorite bands were writing really long form, kind of in a way almost like symphonic works with like
Right.
lots of sections and 8, 9, 10 minute long things. And so when I thought about writing, I wasn't thinking about writing songs necessarily. I was sort of already thinking about, in a way, like a symphonic scope. I tried my hand at like writing, songs maybe later when I was like a junior, senior in high school, freshman in college, when I was just playing in a band with my friends, and started learning how to play a lot of other musicians' music, like, I don't know, the Foo Fighters or Radiohead, or I'm trying to think of the other bands maybe we covered, and that maybe taught me a little bit more about how to try to write like a verse and a chorus and stuff like that. But those are probably like my first artistic sort of memories of like writing music. And then when I started studying an instrument in college, I wanted to study guitar, but there was no guitar teacher at the University of Montana where I went to school. So I studied trombone. And in studying trombone, I was part of a trombone choir.
Yeah.
And that's probably where I first had the instinct to start wanting to write music for my friends in a homogenous instrumental choir, where I played the instrument, so I knew it. I knew them personally, and it was just fun to be like, "Hey guys, I wrote out this little chord progression. Maybe we could play through it." Or, and other people in the ensemble were also writing music for it and stuff like that. So it just kind of almost felt like a little band, and writing music for that was probably the first kind of like serious like instrumental music that I was trying to compose.
So am I understanding you correctly in that you did not play like a lot of us start with like, middle school band or choir or orchestra playing like in the music programs in school, but did I understand it correctly that you started playing trombone in college or were you playing it prior to that?
No, I played trombone in my high school band,
Okay, cool. Yeah.
and but my town was very, very small. I think the population is still maybe like 4,000 something in Western Montana. And, nobody took any private lessons or anything like that. I don't even think I ever saw a professional musician like play an instrument like that until I went to college. But I was playing guitar a lot, self-taught from like, Guitar World magazine tabs or whatever, and just listening. And so the guitar, I didn't read music on the guitar. I read music on the trombone. Wasn't a particularly good trombone player, but I practiced guitar a lot. So that's what I really wanted to do. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to be in a band. I was like, I want to be in a hard rock or metal band. And when I go to college, I'll find my people and we can tour the world or whatever. But when I started playing other kinds of music, orchestra music, band music, jazz, stuff like that, I really got interested in playing trombone and studied it really seriously in college. But that was the first opportunity I had, basically, to study an instrument with a private teacher, which I had never done before.
Yeah, totally. When was your first encounter with a composer? Was this a place with other you said that your friends in the trombone choir were putting stuff in front of each other. I also played in the trombone choir in college, by the way. So I
Nice.
totally understand like the people you were around. I think trombonists are all trombonists.
They're all the
I'm su
same.
yeah, and people will know what I'm saying if you know a trombonist. So, but were you able to connect with composers at that time as well, either via faculty or other students who were deep in it, maybe a little longer than you had been doing it at that point?
Yeah. So I definitely interacted with student composers before I interacted with like a faculty composer because I was a music education major when I first started college. Actually, I wanted to be a math major, but then I started taking some music classes and I discovered that if you want to be a music major, that means you have to take like 200 music courses over the course of 4 years and you can't do anything else with your life. And
Yeah.
so I started, that path, which didn't really allow me to find out if I wanted to, be into math or other kinds of things. So music is kind of all encompassing like that, or music school is. And so there was another composer in the trombone choir. His name was Peter McKenzie. And he actually from the University of Montana, he went to the San Francisco Conservatory to study composition as a master's student. He now works for the Missoula Symphony back in Missoula, Montana, and he's a good friend. But I was really inspired by him because he was somebody who had like a lot of chops, someone who probably, great piano player, probably, studied piano when he was young. And, he's also from a small town in Montana, but he sort of was kind of like a superstar at the college that I went to. And so we all looked up to him, and he would like write stuff for the trombone choir. And we were like, oh, I was like, that's so cool. He writes music and he's going to go to graduate school and study music. Like, I want to do that too. That sounds so awesome. So he was probably like the real inspiration. And then when I switched to composition, which I did, I think my maybe junior year of college. And again, this is the University of Montana. So you can just basically say like, I just showed up and I said, I'm going to study trombone. And there was no audition into the studio and I was like, I'm a composition major now. And I remember the teacher, I just walked into his office and I said, I'm a composition major now. I was like a junior. And I remember him saying, welcome to the dark side. But he was this guy named Patrick Williams, and he mainly ran the theory sequence at the University of Montana. So mostly my experience with him was like learning counterpoint, learning how to write inventions, learning how to write four-part harmony, like fugues, like doing that kind of stuff, because he was really into that. And he was like more of like a choral composer, but he had an ear for very experimental and dissonant music, which I think was nice because it, yes, he taught us how to write in the style of like Bach or whatever, but at the same time, he would pull a score off the shelf once in a while and be like, here's this cello concerto by Ligeti that you should go check out. And at the time I was like, oh, this is insane. I don't know how I relate to this at all. This is so weird. But yeah, that was probably my first interaction with a composer. But I'll finish this thought by saying there was actually a pretty famous composer that lived in Missoula, Montana, if you ever played a wind instrument, and his name was David Maslanka. And if you've played in a college band, it's like a religious experience to get to play like a Maslanka piece because they're really epic and they're really difficult. And it just like, it's really fun and challenging. And so he actually lived in Missoula, Montana, didn't teach anywhere, just had lived there, was an independent, contractor, composer. And I remember looking up his name in the phone book and calling him and saying, hey, can I take lessons with you? And so I took lessons with him after I graduated from the University of Montana for a year.
I think you're the first person I've ever talked to from Montana. And so, and I say that because I too grew up in like rural Kentucky. The town that I grew up in sounds like it was a little bigger, but it was still like 8,000 people. And neither of my parents are musicians either. So I kind of look back at my own background and I'm like, how did I end up here? And I don't know. I guess I want to pose that question to you. I mean, it sounded like you kind of just took the steps. I was also a music education major initially in college. And then I was like, I hate this. I don't want to do this. And so I just had to figure it out from there. Did you have like that sort of musical foundation growing up with whether that's your family or other people in the town that you grew up in? Or was it like junior year onward? That's what really like kicked things off in a real way for you?
So to answer your question, very similar to your upbringing. My family were not musicians. I lived in the same town that my dad grew up in, and my grandparents lived there. And my grandmother was a church organist at the Catholic Church in town. I wouldn't say I had like a particularly strong relationship with my grandparents, but my grandmother did try to get me to take piano lessons when I was a kid. And I took like a couple piano lessons. And she did that because I was always interested in music. I've been interested in music my whole life. Like since I have memories, the only thing I've ever wanted to do is listen to music. And she knew I was interested in music. She was a church organist. So she's like, oh, maybe we should, get him some piano lessons. And so went to this piano teacher. It was like horrific, terrifying. Hated it. I come from a big family. I have 5 siblings, and my parents are still together. We all lived in this house in the middle of nowhere. So it was a small town, but we lived outside the small town. And we had this like janky upright piano that I was supposed to practice for my lessons. I would try to practice. My siblings would like scream at me to like shut up, and I'd go into my lesson unprepared, and then I would get like
Yeah.
berated by this person, and I was like, this is like a nightmare. So I quit doing that. But I suppose probably in those like 2 or 3 lessons I had, I probably like learned how to read treble and bass clef, maybe, or I don't know what I learned from it. But yeah, but no, I don't have my parents are like, they like music and they're very open-minded, I would say, compared to like many of the people who are in rural America. So they were totally open to me being interested in all sorts of stuff. And they had, you know, they're kind of like, I wouldn't say that they're like old hippies, but they definitely have a very like follow your passions, do the things you love, like don't ever do things because you think they're going to make you money. Like they really pushed me, and not pushed me, but they really allowed me to sort of like follow my interests without any pressure from them. So I was basically allowed to kind of choose always what I wanted to do with my time and with my life. And they never once said like, maybe you should do this, or maybe you should do
Yeah.
that, or don't do that. So that I think was very productive for me, because I feel like everything I've ever done with my life has been a choice I made for myself.
Yeah. That's awesome. So, can you share a bit of an overview or like connect the dots, so to speak, jumping back forward a little bit, of your creative journey? Do you feel like you followed a more conventional path, whatever that means to you, or were there any unexpected twists? And I imagine it sounds like you maybe took time off after undergrad to study with the awesome composer in town, and that's already kind of like unconventional, maybe.
Yeah, I would say the only thing unconventional maybe about my path was that it just took a little longer because I was in the middle of nowhere, and I really didn't learn like music theory or certain kinds of things until I almost was like a doctoral student, because my education was pretty kind of like sparse in Montana. I remember when I went to Cincinnati Conservatory for my master's degree, when I took the entrance exam, I failed all of them like miserably. And these are things where they're just like asking you like, what's this interval? And I was like, dude, I don't know what that
Yeah.
is. And so I had to take all these remedial classes. I was taking theory 5 days a week. Anyway, so my path from Montana is I grew up in this town called Polson, Montana, which is again 4,000 people on the southern end of Flathead Lake, about an hour away from Missoula, Montana, an hour north. Super beautiful, and I was interested in music, played a lot of guitar, stuff like that. And then I went to the University of Montana because that was just basically like the only place I knew to go to. We didn't have, like guidance counselors and people. I mean, we might have, but they never asked us if we ever wanted to go to college. And I'm certain that most of the kids I went to school with didn't go to college. It's just not the kind of like culture of where I grew up. There certainly were excellent, some students who really did amazing things, but for the most part, it was just sort of like a high school diploma was like getting a doctorate. And so when I graduated from college, my plan was just like, okay, I'll go to the University of Montana, figure out what I want to do there. Really love math, love music. And so I got there, joined the music department, and started in music education because I thought that was the only way I'd have a job when
Right.
I was
Right.
done. And that's what pretty much most of the students at the University of Montana do, is they get a music education degree and then they teach usually somewhere in Montana. There are many, rural middle schools and high schools that need choir directors and band directors. And that's what I thought I would do just to make ends meet, still play the guitar, whatever. But I started taking all the instrumental classes about how to like play each instrument so that you can teach that. And when I got to like the high strings, I think I took all the winds and brass and low strings, and I got to the high strings like violin, and I had this like flash forward to me in like some rural town in Montana with like 10 students in a room, and I'm showing them how to like hold and play a violin, and I was like, I don't think I can do that for the rest of my life. I don't think,
Yeah.
one, I don't think I'm capable of it. And two, I just don't think I'll enjoy it.
Yeah, right.
And so I actually quit that class like mid-semester. I think I still have that recurring dream where like you forgot you signed up for a class and
Mm,
it's the end of the semester and you're like, oh no, I got to go try to ace my final. Anyway, but I like think I literally just like quit that class mid-semester. I don't even know if I probably got an F or something, and switched to composition. And so because I was so far behind, essentially starting over when I was a junior, I went to undergraduate for 5 years. And the most interesting part of that path as a composer was that I studied abroad for a semester in Vienna. And the only reason I did that is because the University of Montana had this program where you could sing in the choir and do a study abroad in Vienna. It was just like a music department program. And so I did that and I sang in the choir and I went to Vienna. And I remember when I was in Vienna, I took these like strange classes that were kind of piecemealed together. And one of them was like on art history or something. And this art history teacher for one of our classes brought in the composer Beat Führer.
yeah. Whoa.
And
Okay.
so, yeah, exactly. So he came into our class and was like, I've just written this opera about Orpheus. And, he showed us this score and we listened to it. And, all the rest of the people in this choir were like, what the heck is this? Like, this person has no idea what they're doing or whatever. And I was just like, blew my mind. I was like, what the heck was that, dude? Like, I'd never heard of this person, and it just does like, holy shit, this is like a possibility that someone, out there in Vienna is like making this crazy music. And so that kind of like, I would say like lit a fire that when I came back, I was like, okay, I want to know everything. And I want to know all the repertoire. I'm like in the library, I'm ripping CDs and putting them in my notebook, I'm like, I just kind of like went all in, got my crappy little laptop and my Sibelius One software or whatever. And it's just like ripping out trombone solos and crappy piano parts and marimba parts or whatever. And so I did that. And then when I graduated, I was like, okay, now school's done. I guess I got to go get a job. And I got a job working at FedEx Kinko's, which at the time was just Kinko's. It converted actually to FedEx while I was working there. And I actually really loved that job. I'm not going to lie. I think about it often, how much I loved working there.
I love that I get to like go to a place like that and print scores. Like I love that part of the process as a composer,
Dude.
like printing scores, binding them. I get bummed out about iPads sometimes for
Oh,
that reason.
totally.
Like it's like I love making hard copies of my music. So I totally get it.
I loved it. And when I was there, they taught me actually like all this like graphic design stuff and like Photoshop and InDesign and Illustrator, like actually tons of skills that I use a lot to this day. I learned from working at Kinko's, making business cards and stuff for people. But I loved that job and did that for a year. And while I was working that job and just living in Missoula, that's when I reached out to David Mislenka in the phone book and just called him up because, this was like 2003. And so I just called him up and I said, could I study with you? And he was super nice. He was like, yeah, sure, come on over. Didn't have a lot of students. I'm not sure if he had any students because he like was living in Missoula, just like writing band music out of his shed, literally.
Yeah.
And so when I went over there and I was like, saw his whole setup, he was a really important person to just see like, this is how much work a composer does. And like week to week, I remember vividly like coming from one week to the next and being like, oh, I wrote this tune and I'm trying out this chord progression. I had like a single sheet of like paper with some sketches on it. And he was like, I have 100 pages of band music that I orchestrated this week. And I was like, wow. Like, okay, that's like a whole different ball game, And he was the first person who really was kind of like, you need to get serious if you're going to do this. And, that was really cool. And from that, I feel like I just wrote like a little bit better music. And I applied for graduate school that year, which was hilarious. Like the schools I applied to, I had no idea where people went to graduate school in music composition. So I started with Cincinnati Conservatory because the band there had a CD that I had with a piece by David Mislenka on it. So I was like, well, they play my teacher's music, so the band plays my teacher's music. I have to apply there. I applied to San Francisco State University. Still have no idea why I applied there. I have no idea how I
Yeah.
even found San Francisco State University. Turns out, actually, the composer who was working there, though, is pretty well known. Maybe teaches at like either he was taught at Oberlin for a while and maybe Boston. Anyway, I think I applied to Stony Brook University. Anyway, it was just like a very random shotgun. I didn't get into any of them except for Cincinnati, and I don't even know why they let me in. To tell you the truth, I was really out of left field, and I really actually am very thankful that they let me in because I think I would just be in Montana working at a bar or something if they didn't accept me. So I went to Cincinnati, and for 2 years, I actually loved my time there. Really, really loved it. Loved the conservatory. First time in my life where I was just completely surrounded by really excellent, performers and composers. And the composition program was huge, and the composition forum every week. It was super fun, and had really great peers there. Some of my best friends to this day. So and people who are really writing at a very high level. If you know, like Sean O'Pebolo or Michael Ippolito, like really amazing people, and that I really loved. And while I was in Cincinnati, I was introduced to the music of Lutoslawski, and I read Stephen Stuckey's book on Lutoslawski in the library, and I thought, wow, this guy knows a lot about Lutoslawski, and so I better go to Cornell to study with him. And again, applied and got into Cornell, which again was the only place I got into as a doctoral student, and was really lucky to get to spend the time working with him. But those are like two fairly conventional moves, I think, to like end up at the Cincinnati Conservatory,
Right.
and then end up in the Department of Music for a doctorate at Cornell. And that I was there for 5 years because I took a year off to go back to the University of Montana and teach. So yeah, finished there, adjuncted a little bit, and then ended up in St. Louis teaching at Washington University in St. Louis, which is the only job I ever got, and I've been here since.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I kind of feel like similar things have happened to me where it's like I take the shotgun approach, I apply to so many different places, and then it's like, well, only one door opens. And it's like, well, I'm gonna go through it, and that's that. And it's funny that you were talking earlier about like the I guess the interview process at CCM. I also interviewed for my doctorate at CCM, and just remember like they would do the interval thing, and maybe they did this then, and maybe they're still doing it. Like this would have been 2015.
Oh yes,
And,
they
and
were
it's like,
for
and
sure.
then
They
it's
were.
like they like play all the intervals, and they play a chord, and they're like, what is the chord? And for those of you listening who might go there, the chord is, I think they alternate between the Scriabin's Mystic chord and some chord from a Stravinsky thing. But anyway,
Oh God, Symphony
I
of
was like,
Psalms. It's from Symphony of Psalms.
yeah, I was like, what is this? Why would I ever need to do this? I mean, I get it, but it was like very intense. So I feel, yeah, it totally resonates with me.
Well, it's funny is that like because I had no idea what was going on. I mean, I interviewed in 2005. I mean, just leaving Montana to go to Cincinnati to interview was like a huge thing for me. Like, the number of times I'd been on an airplane was probably like two or something. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to Cincinnati. I'm going to interview at this famous music school. But I also was like so naive going into that interview. Like, I remember this is 2005. I bought a pair of black Crocs as my
Mm.
dress shoes. I was like, I have to have black shoes. These are the
Yeah.
only ones I can find that I can afford. So I'm going to get these black Crocs. And I remember they asked me, they're like, what are those shoes in my interview? I was like, I don't know, man. But I remember they tested us on intervals. So when you were there, was Joel Hoffman teaching there?
When I interviewed, I didn't get in. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I
So
think I had an interview with him in it.
yeah, he
Yeah.
was like the interval guy. So what's funny is that because when I played in trombone choir, my teacher was like obsessed. He would start and stop constantly and ask us what we just played. And so actually all of us were like crazy good at identifying chords and things like that. Like even in the jazz band, he'd stop, be like, "What is that?" We'd be like, that's like a major seven chord. And it sounds like maybe there's like a flat five or something." And like we could hear all that stuff because we got quizzed on it constantly as an undergrad. So that's actually the only thing I could do. The rest of it, they were like, "Who are your favorite composers?" I was like, "That's a good question." David Maslanka.
Which, to be fair, that's like a hard question. Like if somebody walked up to me on the street today and was like, "Who's your favorite composer?" I would not know an answer. It's like,
Sure, but that you don't have an answer because you know so much. Like to not have an answer because you don't know
uh,
any, and it's like, oh God, like like Joe Hoffman was like, "How do you know about us?" I was like, "Well, I found a piece of your sheet music for two oboes in like a used bin, you know." Like
Yeah.
it was really dicey. But anyway, yeah, pretty funny looking back on it.
So was there like a defining moment throughout all of that journey, I guess, when it was like very clear to you, like this is what you wanted to pursue as a career, or was it, or did you never even think about it?
Yeah, I've never thought about it. To this day, I don't think about it. I'm just like, I'm gonna make stuff, and right now it's music, and it has been music for most of my life. And also, I don't know, like I was before I got the job working in St. Louis, I was just gonna move to Austin, Texas, because I hung out there once and I had a good time. So I was like, that's where I'll go. I'll go to Austin and just hang out and
Yeah.
live my life. And if it involves making more music, I'll make more music in whatever way or shape that exists. But it's not like I don't try to have a career. I definitely try to, get grants and commissions and stuff, and make things happen. But that's usually just a byproduct of like wanting to work with people and wanting to have experiences. And the idea of having a career, like I can't even fathom actually if I like didn't have a teaching job and I was just like freelance and trying to be a composer. I don't know if I could put composition into that space in my life. Like I'm not sure I would make it, honestly. Like I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, yeah. No, I totally get it. And I mean, I have a mentor who and I've shared this on the podcast before. His name's James Grant. He's a fantastic composer, and he once told me, like, or I guess he instilled in me this idea of living a creative life. Like everything we do can be an act of creativity and that kind of thing. And I kind of feel that too. And when I feel guilty, like, oh, I'm not writing as much music as I can, it's like, well, I'm doing all these other things that kind of, they all feed each other, and it's not really a career, right? It is a way of living, I think, for a lot of us.
No. Yeah, I think I agree with that for sure.
Tyler here, breaking in just briefly to tell you about something I think you're really going to love, and that's Living Classical, my new independently produced radio show. And if you're listening to Music Maker for the ideas and philosophies behind how composers think, well, Living Classical is where you hear how that music actually comes to life. New episodes release weekly on Sundays at livingclassicalradio.com or on our Mixcloud page. So when I was coming up with all the questions for you, I think I was a little worried they'd be too narrow because so much of your work, or at least the way that I see your work, has to do with like the environment or environmental issues and climate change. And I think, and I'm not just saying this because I'm talking to you, and I apologize to anyone listening who's offended by this. I think you're doing it better than anyone else. I just think that like you're addressing these crises and these realities in your music in a way that I think is just, it's beautiful and also acknowledges like how heartbreaking it all is, and it's just really well done. So I feel like we're going to talk a lot about climate change as a warning to everyone listening. So just to preface everything with that. And so I want to go back to, your background growing up in rural western Montana, and I guess that's a place that like it's almost like, I guess you could like deny that part of you in your art making, but it just seems to run very deeply in your work. I mean, the first line in your bio is like it acknowledges your background, and so obviously it's important to you. And it's not just in how your music sounds, but in what the music is actually about. So, how do you think that landscape has shaped the subjects or the questions that you're drawn to explore through your music?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. I really appreciate your kind words. I've been thinking a lot about this because, like, artistic voice is like such a hard thing to like think about when it comes to your own voice. Um, like, I've often thought that, um, you know, you could think of it like you're trying to cultivate a voice, or in my case, I would say it's like something I can't escape. It's almost
Mm.
like a prison.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like everything I make is gonna have some, signature of mine on it, and the idea of like trying to get away from that is just as interesting as just accepting it and cultivating it. So like the landscape thing and the nature thing and the climate thing, it's been present in my work always. And it's not even something that I really consciously think a lot about, like particularly when it comes to climate change. And this is what's kind of strange, is that in the last, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, but 5 years, just culturally, it feels that art making has become a sort of branch of activism, or it's like been very kind of intertwined with like, your art needs to be more than art. Your art needs to, like, help make the world better. And I don't have an opinion on that, but if you're making work about nature, it's basically impossible to make it now, without acknowledging that we're really like fucking it up.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so, the pieces I made before weren't about climate change. I didn't even really think that much about it, which is totally insane because, I spent the first 24, almost 25 years of my life in Montana. And that's like growing up, you know, 18 years in the same house, going to college for 5 years, and then living in that town an additional year, which, so like Montana is very heavily like in my DNA. I meet other people from Montana who are like, oh, but then I went to like, Juilliard for my undergrad. And I'm like, oh, well, then when you were 18, you went to New York, and like, you probably don't ever want to go back to Montana because that's, but I am very nostalgic for it. But I've always made music about nature. And I mean, if you could see where I grew up, like if you could just stand there right now, if I could transport you there for 30 seconds, you'd be like, oh, okay, I get it. I get it. I get all of it. Like it's snow-capped mountains combined with like a massive glacial lake combined with like a prairie valley. I mean, it's like unbelievably beautiful. It's overwhelming actually. And to me, that's just like, there's a sense in my work of awe in the face of that, which is so grandiose. And it's something that I miss the most, probably, is just like when I live in St. Louis, and it's, relatively flat, maybe hilly, whatever, but but you can't really see more than like a block in any direction at any given time, unless you're at a sort of strategic point where you can maybe see more somewhere, like up on a bridge on a freeway going over the river or something.
right, right.
But in Montana, like you see like dozens, if not hundreds, of miles in every direction, no matter where you're standing. And it makes you feel just like so small, but also so just like enraptured by how incredible the natural world is. And so that to me is something that I just have never, that feeling is so strong when I'm trying to make something, or that like if I'm responding to sort of like how I feel and I want to make work about how I feel, or if feelings are driving what I'm doing, like that is just such a strong feeling in my life. And there was periods in my life where breaking up with somebody or someone dying or something became a stronger feeling, but for the most part, this like thread and is this feeling of like just being awe inspired by nature. And I think that also has to do with the fact that as a composer, we make like big things. Like it takes a long time to make something. And
Yeah,
so like if it takes you, let's say, 3 months to write a piece of music, maybe 6 months, maybe a year. I mean, I guess if you're like Mozart or something, it'd take a few days or something. But like because of that, it has a way, I think, of like finding those bigger feelings because it's like more time. So like if maybe something impacts you for like a day or 2 days or a week or 2 weeks emotionally, but somehow those get sort of like rounded out of the equation when you're working on something for 3, 5, 6 months. And so it's sort of, for me, it comes back to this baseline feeling of like, there's the mountains and there's the lake, and like that's really at the end of the day what inspires me. And it started out with just being inspired by that. And if I was to make something right now inspired by that, people would assume it was probably about climate change because it's it's all getting destroyed. And sometimes I acknowledge that very directly, and sometimes I don't. But I think it all kind of feels like it's about that now.
yeah, and I think that's an important distinction, and I guess probably what I was thinking earlier is like because it's so intrinsic to who you are, you're able to I think for the better, see past like the activism component. Like you're able to bring it into people's consciousness in a way that is, I guess, activism. As you said, like you can't really avoid people thinking these things about your work. I mean, it's not up to us at the end of the day what people think about it. But because it's so intrinsic, it's just it's so much better than like if I were to write a piece. I know you have a lot of a handful of pieces about like wildfires, for example. I've never experienced a wildfire. It hasn't touched my home where I'm from, and I feel like if I were to make a piece about that, it would be very disingenuous of me to do that. Even though I feel strongly about it, but for you, it just seems so intrinsic, which I think is a really good thing.
And I mean, I think you could make a great piece about wildfire, and I think you would be really, if you experienced, like I'm thinking back to this summer, I think of like 2002 or 2003 when I was living in Missoula. We just lived in like thick, thick, thick smoke for a really long time, like weeks, if not months, where like you can't even see across the street. And if you live in that, like you're living in it, like you're breathing it, like your throat hurts, like your eyes hurt, like you smell like the campfire all the time, then it's like I think you would respond to it probably very viscerally and want to maybe like, and then it would probably not be disingenuous for you to like
Yeah.
express how that felt, because it's a weird feeling, it feels
Oh yeah.
very apocalyptic. And just even seeing it, when you just look around. I mean, the haze is everywhere now. I know it's in St. Louis, in New York. I'm sure it's in, you know, Cincinnati and other places. Like, I mean, the haze is here from mostly from Canadian fires, I think. But if you see these like plumes where these things have gone off, it looks like a bomb has been dropped
Oh
from a
yeah.
mountaintop or something. And so it's very visually apocalyptic.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And now that it's every summer, I mean,
Yeah.
it used to be an anomaly, and now it's just the norm. So yeah,
Susanna and I had a connection at LAX this January, and it was the tail end of their wildfires that plagued them for like the whole month. I think we flew to Japan and we flew out of San Francisco going there and through LA coming back, and the day we left was the day that all the fires started. And so we were gone the whole time, came back, and because we moved from international to domestic, we had to walk outside, but it was like the first day it had rained since the fires started, so all the fires were smoldering. And I just remember like stepping outside like, "Oh, this isn't good." Like it's
yeah,
just like it was very strange more than anything. It was, of course it was
yeah,
sad, but it was just like I've never smelled anything like this in my life. I've never it's never felt like this to breathe necessarily, like it was very apparent, even in the rain, which I'm sure everyone was thankful for that, but yeah, it
sure,
was unreal.
for sure. But I mean, sadly, I'm pretty pessimistic about all of this, and so that's one of the reasons I don't necessarily think of myself as an activist. Is that I think that we're too far gone personally to sort of undo a lot of this. I mean, we could prevent some of it. We could prevent it from being worse. That's for sure. But like we had like a catastrophic like tornado in St. Louis this year, and it demolished a bunch of the town. And I'm just thinking, like, if these weather incidents happen like this on a regular enough basis, there's just no way we can recover from them.
Yeah.
And if that's the future, then I think it's just going to be difficult. And that's made me think more about my music in kind of like a healing kind of way, or thinking more about just like how can I make music that possibly doesn't necessarily, try to get somebody to get up off their seat and go fight, for what's right, but rather sort of console them a little bit for what is possibly coming.
Yeah. So shifting gears just a little bit, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about this as the conversation goes on, but I want to talk about your music itself a little bit. And, it's been described as, and I quote, fetching and colorful. And you've spoken before about wanting to capture like the energy of a place rather than simply depict it. So how do you translate that physical environment? So whether it's the stillness of a place or like the volatility of a place, how do you translate that into musical form?
Wow. That's the question.
Yeah, I know it's like a mystery, I'm sure, for a lot of us.
I think it is a mystery. um, wow. I think for me, I've spent a lot of time thinking about sort of trying to understand, well, for one, what is a form capable of expressing for me? If I use this form, what am I capable of saying with it? And that's a larger preoccupation I have right now, which I'm really, really interested in, is how forms kind of like create certain kinds of emotional possibilities. And then harmony. I mean, I'm thinking a lot about harmony, like, and in particular, I would say about harmonic rhythm and about like dissonance and consonance. This sounds so, hilarious to say out loud, but it's so basic. But really thinking about like how spicy or how mild the harmony is, and how fast or slow the harmonic rhythm is in relationship to essentially a form. So this is very basic stuff. Like, I mean, as I've, gotten older, I feel like I'm really focused on very simple things like
Mm,
melody, harmony, form. Timbre. I spent a lot of time with timbre as a student studying composition, and I felt like that was, foregrounded a lot. Harmony as well, but maybe only certain kinds of harmony. And I've sort of taken a step back to be like, okay, how do I pace out harmony, melody, form, and sort of see how that makes someone feel, or see how that makes me feel, and does that achieve the thing that I'm trying to sort of say? So, do I have a point of view? And then, like, am I choosing the right set of tools to like express that point of view? That's sort of more where I'm at right now. In the past, I think I just sat down and I just started going, and I thought, well, that's cool. Let me just keep doing that. Or that's not cool anymore, so I better do something else. Or
yeah, right.
I really like this piece by this composer, so why don't I try something similar? Now I'm sort of thinking like, I'm almost 45 years old. I have a toolbox, and now what's my point of view, and how am I going to use the tools that I have to like express that point of view, and not worry so much about whether the techniques I'm using are like hip or contemporary, but rather just thinking about like, okay, what is it that I know how to do, and how can I do those things in a way that gets to something that I'm trying to say?
Yeah. I'll acknowledge before I ask this question that, as composers, we certainly don't have to care or think about what people think about our music. But I will ask, if you have noticed any change as this has evolved for you. Have you gotten any kind of different feedback from not just like listeners of your music, but performers of your music as well? Like, do they seem to notice, or is it a little different working with people as you shift your focus a little more on these simpler things?
Well, that's a really good question. I think like any kind of art making, you kind of have to find your people. And as a composer, sometimes we're put in environments that are, more friendly or less friendly, depending on sort of the situation. So I think it's actually one of the hardest things to do as a composer is to like just like stick with your guns, because you're often going to be put in a situation in which you're kind of like a fish out of water. So, like, for example, if you're writing a piece for a symphony orchestra versus like a, you know, German contemporary music ensemble, they're probably going to have very different expectations of what that composer is going to do. And some people might be able to straddle both those lines, or find a language that straddles both those lines. But I think a lot of composers sort of find the people that have the same sort of interests and kind of that they have, and they kind of work with those people. So for me, it's kind of tricky because I often have kind of different languages that I use, and sometimes if I'm trying to get at something using a certain kind of language, and I'm speaking that language through maybe a group or something that doesn't speak that language, then there can be some friction. And I have to, for me personally, learn how to like live with that friction. that's just going to happen sometimes. Sometimes people are going to want to do the thing you ask them to do in music, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes a listener is going to want to go there with you. Sometimes they're not. An audience full of composers versus an audience full of not composers. It's just like there's so many. I mean, our music gets consumed in so many different ways,
Oh, yeah.
and we write for people with so many different backgrounds and expectations. It's hard, honestly. I actually think that's probably one of the hardest things about being a composer, is managing that and not losing your sense of like self-worth or your sense of like identity, your self-identity as a composer, or not sort of like, because you obviously, I think you have to be very confident in the things that you want to say or the things that but it's very hard to be. You also have to be very self-aware. I don't want to say necessarily self-critical, but if there's things that just like no one wants,
Yeah.
then you can keep working at those things. That's totally fine. But yeah, it's so hard to figure out how to educate yourself and not be really insecure or to not be too confident. Anyhow, that is, yeah, we're getting into some psychology here, but I feel like I'm not sure if I've even answered your question, but it's very hard to know that. And I'm still constantly in situations in which I feel like some things work and some things don't work. And I have to just accept that there's probably a scenario in which this works perfectly, and there's probably a scenario in which it doesn't.
Yeah. It brings to mind an experience that I had my first or second semester of grad school. So I'll say like fairly early on in my own compositional journey where I was writing a piece of music for some commissioners who I knew them personally. And I was kind of caught between these two worlds where I'd never studied composition up until grad school. And so I was kind of I was learning so much about the universe of all of this, and my music was wanting to move in different directions, but it was so early on that like I was still hanging on to some of like the older kind of ideas that I had, and so this piece got caught in the middle, and it was a total failure. And I measure that in the fact that like it's never been played, it's been rehearsed plenty, and one of the commissioners, they were playing through it, and at the time I was like experimenting with nested tuplets, which I never knew was a thing I could do, up until like a few weeks before then. And so, they were playing through it, and then they kind of like got real stern with me, and they're like, even if we played this totally perfectly, everyone would think we're wrong, you know. If we played and I was and instead of like I was that was like very discouraging, but it also kind of galvanized like this idea and that I've kind of ran with ever since, where it's like, well, how can I help performers find imperfection in my music to a certain degree that can like kind of unlock whatever with them and the audience and convey my ideas better than like, you know, whatever. And so, it did two things. It really kind of made me think a lot about what is perfection in contemporary music, which I don't think is a thing that exists. And two, like, who are the people I need to be working with? Because these aren't the people I need to work with, right? And so, and those ideas have kind of changed over time as well. And I've found, as to your point, I found myself in situations where it's like people really celebrate this idea of mine, and then others are kind of like, I don't know about this, So it's a very tricky thing to navigate.
And it's also interesting that we remember these comments and things like
Yeah.
you never know when something's going to really like leave an impact on you that you'll think about a lot for a long time. And I mean, I think about that as a teacher a lot. Like I try to be incredibly careful with the language I use with my students because I know how much I can sort of like potentially set them off on some course that I wasn't being that intentional about, or so. But I mean, I'm the same way, man. It's like one comment from 2009 I'm still like ruminating over in my work. It's like it's really hard to.
On one hand, it's like, man, I really hate that this person said this thing to me. But on the other hand, it's like, this really like made my art move in a direction that I think I want it to be going in. So
Sure,
it's a double-edged sword, I guess.
for sure.
So I want to talk a little bit about residencies because you've spent time in residencies all over the world, and I don't think it was maybe I don't know if it qualifies as a residency, but I know you spent a lot of time in Italy lately as well, and so I guess this is selfish of me because I'm at a point in my own creative practice where for the first time as of this summer, I'm just going all in on residencies. I'm applying like crazy. This is the direction that I want to move in, and so on one hand, I'm just curious, to see what you think about them. But on the other hand, I think a lot of people see residencies as a big mystery as well. Like it's not. I don't remember talking about residencies with my teachers in grad school, for example. So do those residencies, the changes in geography, do they shift your compositional mindset in any way, or does your sense of like home terrain, like whatever is home base to you, maybe Montana, maybe St. Louis, whatever in your mind that it is, does that follow you wherever you go? Whether you're in the New England or Italy or Southeast Asia or wherever.
Yeah, I have had a great time at residencies. I think that they've been really productive in my life, not necessarily because I thought that I made my best work there, but because I met probably some of the most interesting people I've ever met in my life there. And when you go to a residency, you're sort of given this, well, oftentimes you're paired with people who are from other disciplines, usually. And there's just kind of like this base level of curiosity and sort of respect that everybody has for everybody else that allows you to sort of like share your work and for them to share their work to an audience that is like 100% interested in knowing like what you do and taking it seriously and celebrating it. And that is like a dream. I mean,
Right.
how often, I mean, yeah, we're composers. We're like in our own minds thinking about stuff all the time. Maybe, like my wife hears me talk about all sorts of stupid composition stuff all the time. But she's just, she just kind of nods and is like, okay, cool, whatever. And I'm like, probably driving her crazy. But it's like the idea that you can go somewhere and just sit down with people every day for a couple of weeks, maybe a month, maybe multiple months, and just like ruminate over all this stuff that you think about and they're thinking about that stuff too, and that just feels very validating and affirming. And I always leave a residency feeling really like, okay, this is what I'm supposed to be doing with my life, and people
Yeah.
do care about like these things and they care about these ideas, and it's important that I continue trying to figure them out. So that part is huge. As far as like where the residency is located, that's a good question too. The only residencies I've been to, well, multiple of them have been in Italy. Italy's always obviously a good time. And one was in Norway, which was incredible. And then I think I did one other one in upstate New York, which was also great. So, yeah, I don't know. Like the location of them doesn't necessarily leave like a huge mark on my work. The people leave a much bigger impression. And it's always a good thing for me to like get out of town or to like go away and like kind of have a little distance to like look back from. God, I can't remember this quote. I used to have this like great quote by this writer who talked about sort of like the central sort of concern of an artist is like leaving home and like looking back at it. Um, I'll have to find it someday, but I think it's important to get out of town and sort of have a second to look at what it is that you're actually doing every day and every year, and to know if that's really been productive or useful or positive. It kind of gives you a chance to sort of come back and be like, okay, how can this situation work better for whatever my goals are and stuff like that. So, but also, I don't know, this it's also good to be reminded of why you like a place. I was in Italy for a year, in Rome, and honestly, I was kind of jonesing to come back here at the end because I love the American art scene and music scene. Like I miss living in a really diverse city where I can go see a hip hop show and a avant garde art show and a musical, whatever. Like go see all this stuff in a week. And being in Italy, it was all sort of kind of similar to me, and I sort of was excited by it at first because it was different. But then I thought, okay, this is like a vibe, and I've gotten my fill, and now I want to
Yeah.
Now I want to go back to this insane place that is the United States, where the conditions are pretty inhospitable to make art, but people still do. So it comes from a really deep place, which I admire.
I guess to that point, you're talking about people that you meet at these residencies, and I can't help but think of, we follow one another on social media, and it seems that you're deeply connected to like communities of artists in St. Louis where you live. So to that effect, I mean, you kind of do that at home as well, it seems like. Is there a difference between connecting with artists at home versus connecting with artists, elsewhere?
Yeah, there's just like layers of politics at home. I think that
Oh, yeah.
when people are elsewhere, I think everybody's sort of detached. We're starting from a baseline of like, I don't have any expectation, or I have no idea what this is. But at home, it's very easy to sort of like I I've had to tread very lightly. Like I want to, because I'm the type of person I just like want so desperately to be like very heavily involved. Like, please let
Yep.
me be involved. Like right away, I want to be involved. But then I have to be like, okay, you have to know though that like you're not from here. You have to know like what it means, like that, like what you do, what that means, like who you work with, what that means, like who you work for, what that means. You're like your gender, your identity, all that stuff means something in these communities, and you have to sort of be aware of that and sort of know how to navigate that. And I think that's been interesting. I feel like I've learned a lot about that because, particularly in St. Louis, St. Louis is like every issue that plagues the United States is like on the surface happening every hour, every minute, every day in St. Louis. So there is like very little distance, ironic distance, like everything is very real here. And so I find it actually a really good place to make art because your art is all the sort of like things that your art means, like socio-politically, politically, whatever, all that. Which if you're maybe somewhere where there's like a scene, people just sort of like shed all that, or they don't really think about it that much, and it's
Right.
like, oh, we're all doing this, so here we are all just doing it. We're just going to focus on this part of it. Here, it's like that baggage all comes with you wherever you go to something. It's like you're driving a U-Haul truck full of stuff into the scene and being like, here's my string quartet, but it's like actually your string quartet represents like something much much bigger than that here. And so it's been nice to sort of like think about it like that, get a kind of much broader cultural perspective on what it is that we do.
And I should clarify, because we are living in the United States in 2025, that when you say that navigating politics, it doesn't necessarily mean like the overarching like right, left, conservative, liberal, like all that it's like local politics of doing what we do, like having to think in a political way that's not necessarily, the same politics as, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's much more, I mean, politics here could mean like, these two people who work in this space went to high school together and were on,
Right, right.
like one was on the varsity squad, one was on the JV squad, whatever. It's like it's
Yeah.
there's layers and layers.
No, it's like when we moved into our house in Cincinnati and our neighbor's like, "Oh, you guys did marching band. Where'd you go to high school?" And it's like, "We're not from here." It's like
Yeah.
everybody just assumes you're from here, and yeah, I
Same
totally
in
get it.
St. Louis. Most of the people are from here that I've met. It's a city of locals, which gives it a cool culture. It's generations and generations, but it also means that there's a lot of entrenched stuff that is very difficult to navigate, or you have to be very careful about how you navigate.
Absolutely. So usually by the time I ask this next question to folks, they've answered it in some form or fashion, but I will ask you more directly, and that is, what would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice? So basically like the aesthetic, style, philosophy, process, even like the things that form the foundation of your art making.
Yeah, it's a big question, but I kind of feel like what we just talked about is probably the like, most central foundation to my art making is like people, or knowing people, or meeting people, or because I used to think it was traveling, or you know being in the world, or it is being in the world, but I think it's like the people in the world. So, which is funny that I make all this stuff about nature, but it's like Well, maybe that's part of it. Maybe the part of it is like not thinking about people, and the other part is like people. But I am mostly inspired by the people I come in contact with, and I think that's because growing up in this small town where nobody was making, not a lot of people were doing the thing that I was interested in, or I never even really saw somebody who was doing the thing I was interested in. And then finally, meeting some of those people, seeing people who make, experimental art, seeing people who play jazz at really high levels, seeing people who are professional, violinists or any of this stuff, filmmakers, and meeting them and seeing how passionate they are. That is, I would say, the most central thing about my process. Like I am always in contact with people, probably drive my friends crazy because I'm the person who like texts like 10x more than everybody else does in the
Oh yeah,
group thread.
I
And
know that
that's like
feeling.
I just love being with people and anybody. I'm not a someone who can't like if someone tells me that so and so is at the party, I'm not like that I can't show up or whatever. Like I love being in groups of people I don't know. I love meeting new people. So I am out and about always. Like I'm out of my house trying to find people all the time. That's very central. I guess that's sort of something in more recent years that's like slightly related to that is that like field recording has become kind of central to my process in art making, and I think it's related. It's just this idea of like being out and like just like a person might have a cool idea or a cool interest or something that might spark something or a collaboration, hearing a sound or seeing something or whatever might also spark that. So regularly record stuff with my phone or my whatever Zoom recorder or stuff like that. Sometimes I'm very intentional about it. Like with fire ecologies, I was like, I'm getting in my car and I'm driving to California and I'm not talking to anybody and I'm just going to spend weeks audio videoing,
Yeah.
what's going on out there. Other times, just out for a walk and I'm like, wow, do you hear that crazy bug or whatever? I'm going to record it. So those are like, I would say like very high overarching, like why I keep making stuff is so that I can keep communicating with people and so I can keep sort of like sharing how I feel about the world around me. But then there's very specific things too, if you want to get into like nitty gritty.
I'm up for it. Yeah. Well, I mean, it also, I have to acknowledge that it sounds like, people and then basically the environment that you find yourself in. I mean, it just sounds like you're staying open, like it's just an openness. And I often think of myself as a conduit. I think what all of us do is kind of like we're conduits. Like we're not that I believe in like I need to wait for the muse and receive information from some unknown source. It's like if I just pay attention a little harder and just stay open, like the right ideas will come to me in the right forms. And it sounds like that's very much like what that has to do with like talking to the like finding myself at a party, talking to the right person is like, wow, I can't believe that I needed to talk to you. I needed to meet you. Or, walking down the street and it's like, whoa, that sound, like I needed to hear that, and then you make your
Totally.
next great thing.
Yeah, 100% agree. That's where my artistic impulse comes from. I think, I'm more in the world of like Bartok and Ligeti and people who really the outside world was like they let it into their work, and I love that about their work. I think it has like a visceral energy that they might now say is like it sounds like it's from the street. It's like from outside that has that intensity to it. I'm kind of more interested in that kind of art making. There's of course, the separate kind of art making where you like lock yourself in a room for 2 years and see what might happen, which I think is equally interesting. It's just not something I've ever been capable of doing. I'm
Yeah.
much the opposite. I much prefer to. I mean, I even write music at the coffee shop and stuff. I like being around people and with people. But yeah, that's I agree. That's exactly how I kind of think about what I do. So
So tell me about some of the nitty gritty now. Like when we think about your pillars, I guess, what are the nitty, like not the smaller ones, but you know what I mean?
yeah, sure. This is something I wish I had spent more time on when I was younger, and I actually don't think I understood what my teachers were talking about when they were explaining this to me. Because when I think back on it, I think they did mention it. I just didn't follow it up. Like, for example, when I worked with David Maslenka, he really tried to get me to think about process. And process is like so elusive to me. Like, I mean, I have a process. It's just that I've never defined it, or I'm trying now to be more sort of self-aware of my process. And he was having me like try like these different meditation things and stuff. And I mean, that's like his process. He was just saying like, why don't you try my process, see how that makes you feel? Which of course I didn't do because I was a bad student and I, continued to make bad work. And he was like, get serious. Anyway, so my process has become, if I was to think about it, that I move frequently between a piano, like an acoustic piano with paper and pencil, a computer, audio recording, like out somewhere else. And so the computer is I'm either working on a computer at home in silence so I can hear things very clearly, or I'm working on my computer like out at a coffee shop or a brewery or something. And they all have I go to those places for specific reasons when I'm working on different things. So if I need to like organize my harmony, I have to sit down at the piano and write it out with a pencil and paper at the piano. I have to hear an acoustic instrument make the sound so I know if I can physically, like emotionally attach to it or not. I can't do that on a computer. I can't listen to like MIDI sounds on a computer and have any sort of physical emotional response to it. Because I'm not a great piano player, that means I can't just like write the whole piece at the piano. I can only sort of figure out harmonies, maybe some melodies. If I'm trying to figure out like rhythm, I usually have to be on my computer at home, and I usually sing the rhythm. And this is like from playing jazz, like thinking about almost like improvisation. So I come up with most of my melodic and rhythmic material from singing and then transcribing. And I have to do that sort of in silence because that would be insane if I did it at the coffee shop.
Yeah.
When I'm at the coffee shop, that's all editorial, like maybe some orchestration, but mostly editorial notation stuff. Like stuff that I think that is like boring that I want to make more fun, I'll go to the coffee shop and work on. And then with field recording, that is like obviously out listening, trying to pay attention, trying to see if there's something that I can find that I like, maybe finding something, and then coming back to, of course, a quiet place with a computer and listening closely and working in a DAW. So I will spend, I know that if I need to figure out like melody and rhythm, I'll usually do that in notation software, singing and transcribing. Harmony, maybe melody as well, at a piano, acoustically. And then formally, I usually work in a DAW so that I'm not looking at notation and I'm not thinking about who's playing what. I'm only thinking about like how this thing is like moving through time. So I'll often like export things from a notation software, put it in a DAW, like try to listen to it there without looking at it, see if it feels like it needs more, see if like, or less. So I would say those are like the main pillars, is like formally working in a DAW. Yeah, notation software for like rhythmic, maybe melodic, and then at a piano for like harmonic and melodic stuff. Am I forgetting anything? And then just being outside and recording is a big part of it as well.
If you'd like to support this work directly, Patreon is the sole source of income for Loose Leaf Transmissions. It's what makes the time, equipment, and ability to say yes to more conversations and better programming possible. And if you're not ready for ongoing support, you can also leave a one-time tip on coffee. You'll find both options at looseleaftransmissions.com/support. And thanks so much for supporting this work. Well, I'm glad that you mentioned field recordings because I think it's the perfect segue into my next set of questions, which have to do a little bit with technology. And so I was reading an interview that you did with St. Louis Public Radio where you talked about your piece, The Language of Landscapes. And you mentioned that computers can't quite get there when trying to represent nature, and that no matter how much resolution you add to the recording, it never really captures the real thing. And I totally know what you mean. I think I'm interpreting this correctly. Like, it has to do with kind of like in photography, you can't capture the image exactly as you see it because technology isn't human. I mean, it falls short. Which I guess is a good thing at the end of the day. But do you see like this limitation of like not really being able to capture the real thing? Do you see it as something tragic, or as like part of the beauty of weaving those recordings into your music in the first place.
I mean, this is actually a huge topic that if I were like an art historian, I would be able to like talk to you probably for 2 straight hours about the representation of nature in art and its failure to do so. And so I already know. I mean, I need to read more about that honestly, because it is a huge topic in like late 19th century, early 20th century art. This idea of like representing nature and the sublime. But for me, I'm just thinking about like one. I'm interested in like the failure of technology to do certain things. Like oftentimes you can tell something is like digital when you're listening on like a radio stream when people start clapping,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden you get this really noisy complex sound, and you start hearing the aliasing and like all that stuff that happens with the bit rate and the sampling rate and stuff like that that just can't recreate because it's too complex of a sound. And so I'm thinking about that, and I like those sounds actually, the weird parts where like the technology can't pull it off. And so I try to lean into that a little bit with some of the ways that I manipulate sounds. Like in the language of landscapes, there are field recordings. And another layer of this actually is that these things work pretty well in headphones. I assume most people are listening to music now on their headphones, but they're probably not. They're probably listening to like their phone speaker or something, or on their car. Or
Right.
I actually have no idea how people listen to music. I listen mostly on headphones, but when using field recordings on headphones, it can be, if you close your eyes or whatever, it can actually be somewhat accurate. Like, I mean, you feel like you're kind of enveloped in the field recording, but seeing it in a concert hall, it's like, yeah, it sounds like crap, actually. Like,
Right.
like a piped in field recording into a concert hall is like not a good sound. To me anyway, unless you were in like a, totally dampened room with like surround sound and a dome of speakers, maybe it could be incredible. But so that's a big difference, is that like I often think I'm writing for headphones and not for a live performance. That happens sometimes. So I like to lean into kind of the manipulation of field recordings in that regard. Like I use a lot of field recordings where I intentionally downsample the sampling rate, reduce the bit depth, even use, there was a great piece of software that came out years ago that I use called Spear.
Oh, I love that soft. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that.
I'm not even sure if it's still updated. Whoever is updating it, like they're doing God's work, at least for me. And you could sort of resynthesize the sound. I guess I've done that in Max too. I know how to like resynthesize like a live sound in Max, but I love the sound of resynthesized audio, of like sine waves, a computer trying to like use sine waves to recreate like a really complex sound, because it's just so messed up that it actually sounds awesome. So I use that actually a few times in language of landscapes. Like I keep downsampling in quotes the sound by sort of like resampling it with sine waves and Spear, and then taking setting a limit on like removing certain partials that are below a certain amplitude threshold and removing them, and then setting it more and removing them, setting it more and removing them, until all you're left with is like the most elemental and present like 3 sine tones of this audio recording, which are just
Right.
like woo, 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 whatever you like. So I use that a lot as a way of sort of like decreasing resolution on a sound to get to some other weird sound that might, sound more like it came out of like a computer studio in the 1960s or something. But I like those weird sounds that, and I like recording complicated sounds, like the sound of water, running or lapping on the shore, or there's certain like very complicated noisy sounds that digital audio just like doesn't fully pick up.
And so it kind of gets back to like, I don't know, this idea of perfection and imperfection. Like there's no way to really get a perfect version of a recording of anything. And so why not lean into that, And
It's one of the oblique strategies by Brian Eno, is to accentuate the flaw, and that's like one of my favorite strategies actually for making something better. Like if you don't like something that you're making, like lean into that thing. Like make that thing obviously weird. Like if you're trying to get rid of the thing that's weird, like do the opposite. Like make it more weird.
yeah,
I don't know if
totally.
weird's the right word, but like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like the word weird, but I know what you mean. Weird in a good way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I really love this conversation with St. Louis Public Radio that you had. And so you also said in this piece, The Language of Landscapes, it was kind of a way of responding to climate change through both resourcefulness and wastefulness. And so I think that also must be connected to, this degradation of sound that you're talking about, or reusing sound in a way that reflects this idea, but also what draws you to those kinds of contradictions in your process.
I feel like the experience of being alive right now is just like being inundated with like wasteful things and like not knowing, like trying to be resourceful, but it also feels like futile. It's like, I guess I'll reuse this plastic bag to like carry my lunch to school or whatever, but does that really help the issue of like me having 10,000 plastic bags in a, bin in my kitchen or whatever? It's like, or even just like making music. It's like, it's so easy now to like make something on a computer with software and to share it. And like, it feels like there's just a lot of like wasted energy, or like things are not very difficult to get to a sort of baseline anymore. And so I feel like there's just like a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And so like this piece, when I made it with my two collaborators, Mike Capitello and Hannah Collins, percussionist and cellist, we actually like sort of like went to like secondhand stores, and we went to like a wood shop to try to find scraps of like exotic hardwoods and stuff, which I didn't even know you could do that, but you can just like go to like a lumber yard and be like, hey, you guys got any like leftover coco bolo or something? And then like they'll have it. And it's like,
Yeah.
sweet. Like now I have this like awesome piece of wood that like came from a rainforest or whatever, and sounds like a marimba or xylophone or something. And it sounds beautiful. And so we put contact mics on those and stuff, and they sound gorgeous. Like it is a very precious acoustic resource. And so we were thinking, okay, let's try to find, we made a whole junk percussion setup. We were like, doing things that were a little more performative, like weaving Starbucks coffee sleeve into the strings of the cello, and stuff that's like very overt, stuff like that. But then also thinking like, okay, how can we, this is obviously like waste, but how can we use this waste to sort of like make something like beautiful? And maybe that just kind of also feels like what the future could be like. I'm one scene, we had these like styrofoam bowls that we got from a Michael's store, and they sounded great actually as a percussion instrument, so we made a whole kind of movement out of them. And I was thinking like, is this just like what the future is? Are we just going to be like making music with like styrofoam and cardboard and plastic and like junk? And in parts of the world they're already doing that, so yeah, I was just thinking about that a bunch. But resourcefulness is like, I don't know, that's just that's like composing 101. I think like the more you get to the heart of it is like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or whatever, like the most, Bach, like anything that's
Yeah.
been truly kind of set up on a pedestal for us to study has usually been work that is like insanely resourceful. But the wasteful part of it is interesting too. Like, God, there's just so much junk everywhere.
So I want to acknowledge, like, again, you're writing about subject matter that is very heavy. It's very real in this world. It's a very catastrophic kind of thing. And we had talked about fire ecologies a little bit earlier, and you do sample California wildfires in this piece, in a variety of ways. So I'm wondering, like, how do you navigate that line between representing something so catastrophic? Like, this is affecting people's lives. I'm sure, like myself, people who lost their homes in these fires and stuff like that. And certainly your music is not making light of that. But you are still finding space for kind of creation and reflection. So how do you thread that needle?
Yeah. So what's really kind of funny is that first piece you mentioned today, my piece Maple, that actually starts with a field recording of a forest fire that I got from a government website from the Forest Service in Montana, where people who work for the Forest Service were posting field recordings of a fire in Yellowstone Park. So I use that at the opening, and it's just unedited, just chunk of it. It
Yeah.
comes back at the end, but
Sounds like white noise almost, which is
yeah.
interesting.
And so I actually I mean, you wouldn't know this from listening to the recording of Fire Ecologies, but Fire Ecologies originally ended with a kind of like long field recording of a forest fire, and I actually got rid of it. I actually axed that scene in an executive decision like 24 hours before I had to send the audio to like be produced, because I was just like I couldn't make it work. I was like editing, and I was like, I just don't want this piece to end like this. And so I got rid of it. I'm not even sure if it's the right decision, but I did it because it was bothering me. And so actually, the piece have does not have any. There are certainly field recordings that are near forest fires. I'm looking at a forest fire while I'm making it, but you can't hear forest fires anywhere in that piece. I wish there was a way to like list where I recorded those sounds and what they were. But for example, the very opening of the piece is actually water, and even though it sounds like fire. And the end of the piece is a field recording of a high like tension power line in the Sierra Nevada that they're remarkably loud. Like I was trying to find my way up to this fire in the mountains near Fresno, and these power lines, when you're walking near them, are like insanely loud. And so I just stood under there and I was like recording that and like listening to the sounds and listening to this buzz. And those power lines, they turn them on and off sometimes to manage blackouts or something. And when they turn them on, it can spark, and they have caused some of these fires. These like power lines have. So I thought that would be an interesting thing to use at that moment. Plus, that movement is built on like versions of that power line slowed down. And when I slowed it way, 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 way down, it sounded kind of like boots marching. And so I made this like march out of it.
Oh yeah.
So that piece at this point kind of like doesn't have anything direct, but it still has, field recordings of where I'm like observing that. So the point still holds that this catastrophic thing that I'm observing and using is, yeah, it's heavy. It's like hard to, on that same trip, I went to some places that had just burned, towns that had just burned. So like I rolled up in my like Toyota Prius, liberal person, whatever, showed up to town with my video camera and my audio recorder, and here's these people standing, and their house is burned to the ground. Their car is like looks like it's been bombed out, and I was like, I can't videotape this. Like I can't use this. Like I felt way too like voyeuristic or something. I was like, I got to get out of here. This like feels terrible. I mean, it was remarkable to witness and to feel, but I couldn't. And I remember one of my friends who's like a videographer, sort of maybe more like journalistic. He just was like, "Oh, dude, you gotta do it." Like he's like, "You're just a virgin. Like you have to do that. Like this is how people document this stuff. You're just not used to it or whatever." And I was like, "Yeah, that's true," but I couldn't do it. So in a way, I get it. Like and I sort of definitely kind of like stepped back when things got really real. Um, so I don't know. That's an interesting thing to think about, though. Like what I was trying to do there, and what I did do, and what I could have done. I don't know. Things you have to ask yourself, I guess, when your work starts to like venture into a kind of activism.
I think what's also interesting about fire ecologies is you have these kind of, for lack of a better word, like throwbacks to earlier pieces. So like the Revel, like the play of water, like you just take je de, right? My French is not good. I'm sorry, but that's one of the titles of your pieces. You also, I think, is it like a Grieg piece, like you reference in some way? I mean, I'm curious about like the historical significance to you of kind of looking back at those composers writing about nature in their own way. And I guess I'm just curious, like why recontextualize that in the way that you have?
Well, one is because I love classical music.
Yeah, fair.
Two is I'm just really fascinated by how much music is made about nature. And in a way, I guess I'm sort of envious or jealous that we, in our current moment, don't have that kind of naivete and purity that they had when they made those works. The Greek piece is from Peer Gynt, and it's means like deep in the forest or deep in the pine forest, which I was deep in a pine forest when I made the field recording that I used to like base that movement on. And so there's like this other element, which was like they were working sort of purely abstractly based on what they, of an impression of these things. And now we have the ability to sort of like bring a camera and a audio to like actually put that thing in the work itself. So it adds like another layer on top of, what they would have maybe done had they been able to actually depict these things exactly. But of course, then I try to manipulate the thing in the way that they did. So it's not just like not a background ambiance. It's like, it's musical material that gets developed. But yeah, I don't know. It's like there's a reverence. I just love Grieg. I love Ravel. I love Messiaen. I love Stravinsky. I love Chopin. And I also, just to say that these things that we, or at least me, make music about, we've been making music about them forever. I mean, the earliest artwork we probably have on this planet that we know about is depictions of nature, and it's just a constant, and it'll go on long after we're on this planet, which is sort of comforting to know. But yeah, I to use those previous composers, I just am interested in that. I've been doing that for a while now. I did it in a string quartet. Could also have something to do with like the idea of like a sample. I don't use any samples in this work, just titles. But high school in the 90s, where sampled music was like so popular, in listening, like hits were like The Prodigy, or Souls of Mischief, or whoever it was. There's so many samples, and the idea of using a sample feels, even when it comes to field recording or whatever, or another composer's work, feels like a normal way to like, it just feels like using the note middle C or something. It
Yeah,
feels
right.
just like a normal thing to do, having grown up in that. But at the same time, in classical music, we've, at least when we learn the history of classical music, we're often thought of as this idea of like allusion or quotation. And I have never really been I like those pieces, like like Schnittke, these people, or George Crumb. I like those pieces a lot, but usually the allusion or the quotation takes on this like nostalgia, or almost like a protagonist in some kind of like larger, like autocratic or dystopian something or other, where like, remember when things were good and we had a beautiful melody or whatever in those pieces. So I guess in a way I don't think of them like that. I think of them more as just like raw material.
Yeah. So, with all of this in mind, and also acknowledging that you do not see yourself as an activist, you're writing music about landscape and climate and ecology. You're kind of looking back as well to, I'll say participating in like this thread of history that we're all a part of. What do you hope that listeners become more aware of through your music, or is that not even like a consideration?
I don't think I actually have an answer to that question, because I can't think that I want them to become more aware of anything, to tell you the truth. There might have been a time where I thought I'd really like them to care about climate change, and maybe change their behavior, or vote differently, or do something that will help. I guess I still want them to do that, I suppose, but I guess I would be wanting them to do that whether I made music or not. I'd be telling people, or something in some way, shape, or form. But I guess probably that the natural world is like unmatched, in my opinion, when it comes to creativity and beauty, resourcefulness, wastefulness,
Yeah.
all of these things, and that it's right outside our front doors, and that it's available, and it's eternally sort of inspiring. And yeah, I guess maybe that.
Yeah, for sure. I guess also, in talking about older music or any other kinds of music at all, what is a piece of music, a song, a film, a book, or a piece of art, or any number of those types of artistic artifacts that have changed the way that you thought about your work? Perhaps even like fundamentally changed the way you thought about things.
Most of my work that we've talked about today has been the stuff that I've written about nature, and that includes field recordings and things like this. That I would say was, I would say that approach kind of solidified, or I became much more sort of like inspired and emboldened to continue that work after reading the work of Terry Tempest Williams and Elizabeth Colbert. Terry Tempest Williams, a book called Refuge, which is about the Great Salt Lake, and it sort of weaves in. It's sort of like a creative nonfiction, basically, and it kind of weaves in this stuff that's sort of like documentarian, a nonfiction about sort of the Salt Lake's shrinking and bird populations and things, with her own personal history, family history with cancer. And that sort of feeling of like, okay, there can be something that's kind of like documentary-esque in here, in like that I'm like writing about or making something about a field or using a field recording and talking about like current events. But also at the end of the day, I have my own just like personal history and personal feelings that are going to come out in the work that I'm making, and I'm kind of weaving those two things together. And Elizabeth Colbert, not so, I would say, creative, as far as like, not that she's not creative, but like not so much in the genre of creative nonfiction as the Terry Tempest Williams is. Hers is just basically more nonfiction, almost like journalistic. But I guess the way that she tells the stories is very creative, and kind of tells stories about climate change and other things regularly in the New Yorker, but then publish some books putting together those articles. And I found those just to be really inspiring to bring in an element of like, your own personality into something that's nonfiction. Those were very fundamental in like me being like, okay, I can continue with this path of making stuff that has an element of it that is like nonfiction. I had written like a very short, we called it a micro opera. And then that micro opera, there was actually like a video interview in it with like a climate scientist, like talking about things. There were slides in it with text from like the 19th century, which talked about how the government then was sort of denying climate stuff. So it was like very much like nonfiction, but then my own music kind of woven into that
Yeah.
through a kind of character. So that I would say, mm, but I think that's probably the one that's like been most interesting. I'm also a huge fan of like the artist Sally Mann, and I read her autobiography and I really loved it. Just about art making, about being an artist. She also lives in a small town in Virginia, and just it's kind of like from her, like this idea of like the quotidian, like that there is stuff all around you in your daily life that can be the subject. I mean, hers like was very controversial because she took photographs of her kids. It became like a huge issue in the 90s or early aughts. But just this idea that like there's stuff just in your house, like in your yard, whatever, that can become the subject of something really profound if observed in a certain way or treated with a discipline and technique. And so that was really inspiring too, to just feel like everything you need is right here in this room, and you don't need something more than that. You can make something here that is really powerful, and if you work hard and develop your technique, and again, like you were talking about sort of earlier, about sort of just being open, and if you're patient and you observe more closely what's going on around you. Yeah, so I think those are, it's interesting that none of them are music. Maybe I can find a music example, but
Not required. I kind of like that you didn't say anything musical. It's like talking to people like, oh yeah, the Rite of Spring. And it's like, yeah, join the club. No, I'm just kidding.
music for 18 musicians,
Yeah,
remixed
yeah,
by him sing.
yeah, yeah. Well, certainly, we've talked a lot about, I guess, the environmental side of your music, but that's not the only kind of music that you write or subject matter that you write about. You've also written film scores, chamber works that live outside of this environmental framework, I guess, or maybe you still see them as part of it. But I'm thinking like explicitly subject matter wise. Do you approach those pieces a little differently than if you're writing about wildfires, for example, or climate change, or is it more or less like the same kind of approach to you?
There's usually something that I'm like after that's like extra musical at first. then it becomes very musical. Like, trying to think, I wrote a piece for the Aspen Music Festival this summer, and it's sort of like fake folk songs. So I was just like writing, like thinking of myself as like an archaeologist who found like a fragment of a melody or a fragment of a rhythm or something, and then like being in a situation where I'm like the archaeologist who's giving my TED talk on this thing that I found, and I have to say like, well, this is what this could sound like if this was completed, and then like
Right,
I've
right.
made up my own fake version of it, which of course is like going to be based on like how we think of what that would be in 2025. And so I really enjoyed that, but that was almost like a just a trick, a process trick to get my brain to sort of like be interested in like solving a problem, like I mean, that's not totally true. I was around a bunch of really cool archaeologists in Italy, and I saw how creative they were with how little information they had and how creative they were with where they went with that information. And I was like, whoa, I thought you guys like had to like be so like hardcore about like, how you discern all this information. And in some ways it's actually kind of interesting that you use your creativity to solve this because I don't know, it kind of helps everybody in the room understand that thing better by you kind of like, you know, discerning something creatively from it. And I thought that was really cool. And so I've done that in a couple of my recent pieces actually, of like this idea of like finding a fake fragment. I think it's fun because then it's like, well, here's this like, it gives it for me, it like contextualizes maybe like an extended technique or something to think about
Right.
it more like this is how this person played this like 2000 years ago. This is how they would have played this thing. It doesn't sound like the way we play it now. And like if the extended technique was like the fundamental way that this thing was played, and then like having to make a piece of music that maybe was like had more of a traditional purpose, like it was a song or it was a dance or it was had some kind of ceremonial use or something, but it's from this weird sound or whatever, then I don't know. I thought that was like a fun way to try to make some pieces. But then once I got past like that, then it's well, now I got to like develop it, and I got to like
Right.
put it in a
Writing a
form,
piece.
and yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's cool. I've never thought about making music in that way. I don't know. Our imaginations are crazy. It's really cool. So, totally, probably, maybe not off topic, but I wanted to make sure that I asked you about tennis. I heard that you are really into tennis. I think Susanna told me that. I said, "Hey, I'm talking to Chris Stark soon," and she's like, "Are you going to ask him about tennis?" And I was like, "Why?"
Dude,
And
that's
so,
hilarious.
and so I don't know how she knows that, but I have noticed on your Instagram some tennis here and there. And I'm always fascinated by how artists connect their creative lives to things outside of art, especially when it's sports, when it's ingrained in us, like art and sports are incompatible, which I
Totally.
think is like not true at all. So, what is it about the game that resonates with you? And do you see any overlap between, I don't know, maybe like the rhythm of the game or the mindset of tennis and how that connects to composing?
Yeah, I kind of agree that like sports and arts are definitely like they very rarely intermingle. And I
Yeah.
almost bring it up to nobody that I play tennis or that I'm even interested in sports because I just know it's fraught, with lots of high school emotions. But the I got into tennis. There's a violinist who's become a good friend of mine from the St. Louis Symphony, and he was into tennis, and he gave me a tennis racket like I don't know 8 9 years ago, and he's like, "Here, try it out." And I was also, I live in St. Louis where it's warm for 9-ish months out of the year. And I needed to do some exercise because I was getting a little too heavily invested in like the craft beer scene. And so I thought, well, I'll try tennis out. That looks fun. And I don't really like, going to the gym or, it's funny because I grew up playing sports, and I was like really serious about track and cross country and stuff in high school and stuff like that. But I just don't like doing that stuff. So I started, hitting the tennis ball, got myself a teacher, and I just loved having a weekly lesson. Like it just put me back in that like space of like college where I was like, oh,
Mm,
it's so nice to like meet with somebody for an hour every week. Like I look forward to it, and I get to practice in between the meetings, and like get to like have this interaction with this person. And now that I'm like older and I'm a teacher, it's like I think about the way that they teach me, and I'm like using some of those strategies now with my students. And I'm like super interested in having like I've taken lessons from lots of different people and developed really amazing relationships with teachers again, and it's fun to feel like a student again.
Yeah.
But also, tennis is extremely technical, like music making is, and it requires like tons and tons and tons of repetition on very small technical things, just like music, like playing an instrument does. So it just like scratches like all of those like itches, and then you have to play a match and you get nervous like you do when you have a performance. And then, you eat somewhere in the match like you do in a performance, and you criticize the hell out of yourself like you do when you play an instrument. And, it's like all the
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
same emotions. So it's been super fun. I mean, personally, just like health wise, I've appreciated it because I feel like I'm in better health than when I started. And also, strangely enough, it's like a bizarre, like social scene tennis is, because you obviously have to play tennis with people, and like you end up like joining leagues and playing at all these different clubs and playing in all these different parts of the town. And so I used to think tennis was like this really elitist sport, and for many it still is. There's definitely still very bougie country clubs where you have to wear like white clothes and play on grass or whatever. That exists. But I've actually met probably like the most diverse group of people I've ever hung out with through tennis, and dozens and dozens of people. So it's like created this whole interesting scene of yeah, people from all walks of life in St. Louis that I now interact with, and regularly. I mean, I play like all the time, like three,
Yeah.
4, sometimes 7 times a week. So it's been an amazing social outlet outside of music, and also just like it's really fun to practice again, learn something new, get better at something as you get older rather than get worse at everything.
Right. 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 Yeah, it's not quite the same, but I have a really good friend who is he's an amazing trombonist, kind of bringing things full circle here near the end of our conversation. Went to college with him, and he has this. He does competitive Super Smash Brothers, and he has this like. It's not like it's part of school that he does. He's getting his doctorate, so I don't want to confuse this with that. But he has this whole thesis that he'll break it down for you if you ask, where he like can tell you exactly how playing Super Smash Brothers aligns with playing trombone, and he's very very serious about it. And he's like, playing this game has made me a better trombonist, and here is exactly all the reasons why. And he'll talk to you for like an hour about it. So I think it's important for us to have things that we do in our lives that's not the thing that we do in our life, but can certainly like help things along, you know.
Definitely. Well, that's like totally fascinating. But Super Smash Brothers and trombone playing, somehow I get it. Somehow I get that one could make you better at the other. And I know it seems compatible.
Yeah, yeah, I don't know. I just like playing the game. I don't want to think about it. Getting into my final set of questions here, and these are questions that I ask everybody. What do you think you would be doing artistically or non-artistically if it wasn't composing?
I'd be a graphic designer without a doubt. I learned some of that at Kinko's, and I loved it. Would love to do that. I love the idea of making like a design, like reduce, like first of all, you can work quickly. I love working quickly, but then secondly, like reducing something down to like its elementalness.
Mm,
I think I would
yeah.
love to do that for a living.
Do you work with a lot of like graphic notation in your work, or have you?
Not really, no.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting.
I guess it's never too late. So, what are you trying to get better at in your creative life right now?
Form.
Mm.
Trying to get better at form and harmony. How harmony and form interact. That is the thing that I'm like most preoccupied with at the moment.
Was there a moment that made you start thinking more about form, or like uh, yeah,
Yeah, I read these like gigantic books by Karl Ove Knausgaard called My Struggle. And they, at one point, he talks about, they're sort of like philosophical in certain ways, in other ways, not at all, very mundane in other ways. But he talked about sort of like form and how very rarely does an artist or a composer or somebody like, or an author like change form. And the people who have are sort of like, maybe like a Schoenberg or somebody who like then immediately sort of like has disciples that like carry out their sort of wishes. Like it's very difficult to change form. And he equates this to basically that form is like this prerequisite for like being close to other people. It's like this olive branch you give to other people that allows them to sort of like receive your work. And it's like, when I thought about that, I was like, oh, that's like just amazing. And so then I was like, I better start studying like form more seriously, because as composers, I think we just like invent forms very frequently, or like thinking that we are inventing forms just like we're inventing harmonies and scales and whatever else. But I just got really interested in that idea of like the form just being this thing that's like this meeting ground with somebody else. And if you want to communicate with them, you sort of have to like present it in a form that allows them to hear your thoughts.
Oh, I love that. I need to check that out. Maybe everybody should check that out. Sounds like. Speaking of which, is there a tool that you use in your practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from? And this could be like an actual object, it could be a process, it could be software, anything that you see as a tool.
Oh man, I feel like, everybody I know now is like composing in a DAW and, recording things. And yeah, I don't know. That's actually a good question. I don't think I'm using anything that everybody else isn't using, like I'm pretty sure that I'm using tools that everybody else uses. There's nothing that I'm using that is unusual, MacBook, Logic, Sibelius,
Yeah.
piano, paper, pencil, Zoom recorder. That's a good question, though, actually. Probably something I'll think of when we're done with this interview, but I don't think I'm using anything unusual at the moment.
Well, if you think of anything, I'll edit it into my outro and I'll let everybody know. So,
Okay.
My final question, and this is again, this is something I ask everybody, and that is, what is something that you have never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
Wow. I've always wanted to share with people. I think that I'm a very patient person. So I think my art, not always, but often moves sort of slowly. I think in my heart of hearts, I'm like a minimalist. I like when things are specific. So specifically complex or specifically simple. What do I want them to know about my art? I don't really have. I make the thing and I hope that they'll listen to it and I hope that they'll take it seriously. But at the same time, if they don't want to, that's okay too. I don't really have anything that I want anybody to know
Yeah,
about my art.
it's the hardest question that I ask people, so I'll take it. Oh, Chris, this has been awesome. I wish we could talk for longer, and I'm sure one day soon we will. But for now, I just want to say thank you so much for your time today and for letting us get to know you and your work a little better. And yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, man. And seriously, what you're doing here is a huge resource. We need more, libraries and archives of people talking about their
Mm.
work, because especially in this longer form, there's just so much short content and so much highly edited and curated content, and not enough just opportunities for people to kind of like fumble through their words and get to something maybe that they wouldn't hear otherwise. So seriously, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, my total pleasure. And I'm anti short form, so I'm glad that this is resonating with at least one person. So thanks.
Cheers.
So this conversation felt especially timely for me personally. I've got several place-based projects on the horizon, including pieces about my own rural hometown in Kentucky, and just hearing Chris talk about how geography and memory shape his work gave me a lot to think about. What really stuck with me, though, is the way his music responds to the world without trying to make a statement. It's not activism, it's just how the work naturally takes shape. There's something deeply honest about that. All to say, much gratitude to Christopher Stark for joining me on this episode of Music Maker, and you can learn more about him and his work at christopher-stark.com. I'm Tyler Kline, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. The show is produced by Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. You can explore more episodes and find ways to support the work at looseleaftransmissions.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you back here next time. If this has been your first time listening to Music Maker, well, good news. There are over 40 episodes in the archive. I've also got a companion show called Micro Maker with short excerpts from these interviews, with new episodes releasing multiple times each week. And if you want to make sure that you don't miss anything, follow both shows on whatever app that you're using. Thanks again for listening.